An international human rights organization has come out with a recent report flagging the use of identification documents in facilitating persecution and killings of the Rohingya population in Myanmar. Fortify Rights went to the extent of comparing what's happening in Myanmar to the Holocaust and the 1994 genocide in Rwanda. 6 million Jews were killed by the Nazis in the 1940s, while 800,000 people, or 75% of the Tutsi population in Rwanda, were killed in a span of 100 days. What lessons can we learn by studying history and how genocides were perpetrated across time and across societies? To talk more about these, we're joined this morning by Dr. Ken MacLean, a Clark University professor at the Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies and senior advisor of Fortify Rights. Good morning from Manila, Dr. MacLean. Good evening there in the East Coast. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
All right, Dr. MacLean, it's quite interesting that your new report compared 3 separate cases of atrocities in different periods of time and in different places. So why choose to compare the Holocaust, the genocide in Rwanda, and the ongoing crisis in Myanmar?
It's an excellent question. We could have made other choices, but I think in our view, those 3 case studies really show what we call the genocide by attrition. The slow way in which identity documents in particular are used to identify, persecute, marginalize, and eventually, in some cases, eliminate entirely certain segments of the population. And in that regard, all 3 of the genocides that we explore show great similarities across all 3 cases.
Let's try to discuss them, Dr. MacLean, one by one. First, beginning with the Holocaust, how do you think this was done? How were identification cards used in order to identify, persecute, and eventually kill the Jews in the 1940s?
It's an interesting case. The foundations of that process were already in place prior to the Nazi regime taking power in 1933. But what they began to do very quickly is instrumentalize the census, national ID cards, and over time they began to racialize them when they began categorizing different segments of the population. And the Jews in particular were over time denied or had their citizenship revoked, their property seized, prevented from taking jobs and so on. And eventually they were pushed into ghettos and then exported to the concentration camps. So it's not to say this would not have happened, but given that the Holocaust was such a heavily bureaucratic genocide, that really looking at how government documents facilitated and accelerated the ability of the Nazi regime to carry out the genocide is really important to recognize.
And in Rwanda, there was also a divide between the Hutus and the Tutsis. How did the identification cards in that particular situation affect the eventual genocide that took place in Rwanda?
In the Rwanda case, there are some important differences. And I would mention here that ethnic identity was quite fluid until the colonial period under Belgian rule. And for a variety of reasons, they began to essentialize different, or what they imagined to be important differences between Hutu and Tutsi, which historically were quite fluid. And as the Hutu extremists came to power in the late 1950s, as the colonial period came to a close, these differences were formalized in national ID cards, which for the first time ever clearly indicated whether you were a Hutu or a Tutsi. And this became critically important in 1994 when the killings began. People were forced to present their ID cards at checkpoints and in other settings. And if you were said Tutsi, you were killed on the spot. If you couldn't produce an ID card, either because you didn't have one or you hid it to hide your identity as a Tutsi, you were also killed on the spot. So this card was a matter of life and death for those 100 days in which the mass killings occurred.
And your report is saying that this incident, what happened in Germany, the Holocaust, and in Rwanda in 1994 are also happening in Myanmar now. They have this national verification card. It's just also used to determine their ethnicity. But talk to us how peculiar that situation is in Myanmar, because as I understand, they are being the Rohingyas are being treated as Bengalis or foreigners.
They are by some segments of the population, the government and local government officials. And of course, with the Islamophobia compounding with ethno-nationalism amongst Buddhists, there's a general tendency to ascribe or describe all Rohingya as Bengalis. We are not saying that a genocide of the type that happened with the Holocaust or in Rwanda is due to happen now. The violence directed against the Rohingya at multiple periods over time, and most recently in 2016 and 2017, forced 750,000 of them into Bangladesh. So of the Rohingya that remain, they continue to face the same forms of persecution that helped prompt 750,000 people to flee to Bangladesh for their lives. And that are restrictions on freedom of movement, access to education, access to healthcare, access to employment, and many other rights, including freedom of religion. And those hindrances to the exercise of those rights falls under Article 2 of the Genocide Convention, where you are doing physical and mental harm to an entire population. You are preventing them from exercising the reproductive rights, and you're not providing recourse because they are denied the status of citizens, even though historically they held that during the post-colonial period. So this is really an example of xenophobia.
And your report saying this is a genocide by attrition because there's a slow taking away of rights that has led to eventually, in some cases, for example, in Rwanda and in Germany, the killings in these situations. But talk to us about how prevalent this issue of national verification cards is in Myanmar still, despite the coup that happened last year.
Sure. The process began several years ago. It's taken different forms over a period of years. But since the coup that happened in February 2021, when the military again seized power, efforts to push Rohingya to take the national verification card in order to have any rights whatsoever accelerated again in March, only a month later. And again, we find in the testimonies we gathered, Rohingya being forced to deny their existence, to deny themselves as Rohingya, and accept the NVC, which lists them as Bengali, which then strips them of all legal rights because they are categorized as illegal immigrants, when in fact they've lived in the country for generations, if not longer.
After studying what happened in the Holocaust and in Rwanda, what lessons can be learned and can be applied to Myanmar to prevent similar atrocities?
I would say the findings of a report, while focused on Rohingya, are actually more broadly relevant, and that is to pay particular attention to when governments anywhere instrumentalize identity as a tool of persecution, oppression, and in some cases, physical elimination. These things happen slowly over time and step by step by themselves. They may not seem to be much, but when you look at them in a cumulative fashion, you can see that these are actually precursors to genocide.
And talk about the genocide in Rwanda, the Holocaust, and even the things that are happening in Myanmar right now. All of these are dark periods in the history of these respective places. In the Philippines, we also have a dark period. We went through that. What lesson can we learn from all of these in order not to repeat the past? What steps should be taken?
Well, we unfortunately keep repeating the past. I'm not sure how well we've actually learned our lesson, but I think this report really shows, certainly in the case of Myanmar, the ways in which the past, even the places beyond Asia, in this case, Germany and Rwanda, are highly relevant to understanding the dynamics that are underway. And they offer insights into what can be done. And we list several steps that can be taken in our recommendations. First and foremost is abolishing the national verification card system, recognizing other forms of identity, and moving to provide all Rohingya citizenship rights, which is what the vast majority of Rohingya want. They want to return to the country and resume their lives as full citizens of the country.
And Dr. MacLean, just to be clear, is the issuance of a national identification card by itself, is that a bad thing? Or is it the steps taken by a government after the issuance of the identification card that really creates a problem in these situations?
There's nothing necessarily wrong with having a national ID card for the people of a particular country. That's a legitimate thing for a government to require of its citizens and immigrants. What the NVC, the National Verification Card, does is it singles out a particular population and then systematically denies them rights that they are guaranteed under the Constitution of the country and certainly under the UN Declaration of Human Rights and the other covenants that followed. And so when you create a special category of identification card that facilitates the ability of officials to persecute that group, then it becomes deeply problematic, and we should all be concerned when that happens.
Mm-hmm. And lastly, Dr. MacLean, what are your insights as to how the crisis in Myanmar will be resolved? Are you seeing any positive signs moving forward, or are we still going to see more of the same in the coming years ahead?
I am sorry to say, I think we will see more of the same. Things have reached a stalemate that the military is unable to suppress popular opposition, both violent and nonviolent, to the regime. At the same time, civil disobedience and the more recent violence directed against military and government officials, while significant, has not been able to dislodge the regime either. And unless somebody comes in to tip that balance in a significant way, I'm not expecting any significant improvements in the near future, unfortunately.
All right. Thank you so much for your insights this morning, Dr. Ken MacLean, Senior Advisor of Fortify Rights.
Thank you very much.